Let me take you back to 2008, to that wonderful period of implosion. At that time, on both sides of the Atlantic, we discovered that the rules were not fit to purpose. But there was a profound difference between the way that this realization hit the American authorities compared to how it impacted the European Union. In the United States, authorities got around a table in the middle of the night, panicking, and asked themselves the pertinent question: how do we stop this crisis from consuming us? In Europe, we asked a different question. How are we going to pretend that our unenforceable rules can still be enforced given the circumstances? These are not the same questions. The answer you give to the first question might save you and might lead to recovery or to stabilization. The answer you give to the second question is highly unlikely to do so. And that may have something to do with the fact that the European Union, and the Eurozone in particular, is in the state it is in today. The problem with, I'm going to take seriously the title that we have, firstly, an agenda for the future of Europe, and also the flexibility versus discipline issue. While the rules of the Eurozone have proven to be unfit to purpose, flexibility of those rules cannot be the solution. Because I do not believe there exists any degree of flexibility, given the current interpretation of the rules, that would give us a way out, that would stabilize the European economy. As I see it, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm convinced that I'm not. The European Union is disintegrating, and it is disintegrating under the burden and the weight of a serious systemic failure, which makes flexibility insufficient, as I just said, and discipline impossible. In the United States, if 6 years after the great financial crisis, unemployment had remained at 12%, the government would have fallen, the Fed would have had a spasm and would have changed its colors as well as its personnel. There is no way that the United States political system would survive had it continued to reproduce the same policies that failed in this most spectacular fashion. In Europe, we have to ask ourselves a very pressing question. How come we have the same personnel, more or less, manning and womaning the trenches, and the same policies? The answer, in my view, has to do with the democratic vacuum. I'm not referring to a deficit, I'm talking about a vacuum at the heart of our decision-making processes within our institutions. We have a very interesting paradox. We have functioning democracies, and we have democratically elected representatives sitting in our institutions, but the decision-making bodies are purely unaccountable. There is absolutely no sovereign people or parliament that can keep checks and balances on, let's say, the Eurogroup. Everybody leaves the Eurogroup, nobody actually defends, none of the finance ministers really defends the decisions. And this decision-making body, as a body, is not accountable, cannot be dismissed by any well-constituted institution, parliament, whether at the national or the parliamentary level. The result of this is a vicious feedback mechanism that takes us from the pretense that we are enforcing rules that cannot be enforced into economic outcomes that are abysmal. That causes illegitimacy in the eyes of our voters. And then the only way that the system can produce and procure and reproduce the same rules and the same policies is by increasing degrees of authoritarianism, which lead to a further reinforcement both of the economic failure and the illegitimacy of the European Union. This is the systemic crisis that I have been referring to. Let me give you a very simple example from the Greek negotiations, in inverted commas negotiations, because I don't believe there are any negotiations happening, as there were none when I was involved. We were negotiating for the right to negotiate, but not for substance. As we speak, there is an attempt by the European Commission to complete the Greek review, while the International Monetary Fund, as we know from certain leaked conversations very recently, is struggling to adhere to its own charter, to the idea that we should at long last stop the extending and pretending of the Greek crisis by having the kind of debt relief that I was advocating and which I had presented to you here a year ago, which turns out to be exactly the same as that proposed by the IMF, in order to be able to have the small but positive primary surplus targets, which are essential for stabilizing the macroeconomy of Greece in order to make recovery possible and turn that, my long-suffering nation into a reformable nation or social economy. And now we have this amazing conundrum whereby the European Commission is making noises towards the Greek government that it wants lower austerity than the IMF does, but at the same time is not prepared to give the debt relief that the IMF wants, which means that in the end, the promises of lower austerity by the European Commission are bogus, and the IMF knows that if it goes along with this, they will have to come back next year imposing even harsher austerity than what the IMF is proposing today, and therefore you have this complete breakdown of communications between the Commission and the IMF, with the Greek government idling around waiting for the inter-troika conflict to end. This situation is not the result of some personal failure of the persons involved in these affairs. It simply reflects, Greece is a litmus test, it's simply the canary in the mine reflecting the systemic failure of the European Union and the Eurozone. Let me give you a couple of examples, if I may. Take, for instance, the fiscal pact on the one hand and quantitative easing on the other. They are working against each other. These are the two rowers that are rowing in the opposite direction that somebody mentioned as a parable. Think about it. Our fundamental, profound difficulty, macroeconomic failure in Europe is a very low level of investment. We have excess savings that are unprecedented on this continent. And now, at the same time, we have quantitative easing being the only substantial policy for boosting investment and for refloating the European economy, refloating aggregate demand. But the fiscal pact is driving budgets towards neutrality. It's economics 101, that when you have excess savings exceeding investment massively, if you are driving the budget towards surplus, then you are pushing your economy towards a posture where you're going to have a large current account surplus. Markets look at this and immediately boost the euro against the quantitative easing process of the ECB. A quantitative easing project, the only chance that it has of success being in reducing the value of the exchange rate. So the fiscal pact and quantitative easing are cancelling each other out, because the failure of quantitative easing to push the euro down is also a failure to create the kind of investment boost that would make the fiscal pact sustainable. This is one example. Let me give you another example, if I may, briefly. Take the banking union. The banking union, a banking union would be essential. We have it in name in order to violate it in practice. The differential probability of bail-ins throughout the Eurozone makes a mockery out of the idea of a banking union. But that is not, again, a failure of those who designed the banking union. It is entrenched in the constitution of the Eurozone. Think about it. The euro, as a currency, is a hybrid, something between a fixed exchange rate regime and state money. We have a central bank without a state and states without central banks. So we are a halfway house. And the only serious disciplining device within our Eurozone, and Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble is perfectly aware of that, we've discussed this extensively, is what keeps a government on the straight and narrow of the Troika policy or of the Eurozone. It is the probability, the significant probability of a bank run affecting a government that strays from the beaten path of the Eurozone, of the Eurogroup, and a background which is utterly independent of the banking fundamentals of those particular banks. So the banking union can never be consistent with the very foundation of a euro as a halfway house, as a hybrid between a fixed exchange rate regime and a state money. Under those circumstances, given those systemic faults, there can never be a level of fiscal flexibility within the existing rules which is consistent with recovery. There can never be a level of austerity that can stabilize private and public debt. And there can never be a quantitative easing program that can stabilize investment. Because as Mr. Mersch said very correctly, there are limits to what the European Central Bank can do. So what can we do? Is this systemic crisis determined to run amok and cause the disintegration of our union? I believe no. I believe there are things we can do within the existing rules to reinterpret them. Rules are being reinterpreted every day in a manner that would stabilize the Eurozone. But it requires political will and requires a great deal of political action at the level of our parliaments and our level of our electorates in order to pressurize our authorities and our institutions to move in that way. I believe that it is essential that to stabilize the Eurozone as it is, we need to simulate a federal solution. Unlike Enrico's suggestions of a federal treasurer, we cannot possibly federate the treasury without having a substantial budget, federal budget, and we cannot have a substantial federal budget without federation. But we can simulate federation. Mr. Mersch completely correctly said that within his constraints as a central banker, it is impossible to have helicopter money or to do anything different to what you're doing. This is correct. But there is nothing to stop us within the current regulations and the current charter of the European Central Bank to agree at the level of the European Union Council, to have a new deal for Europe, which is to be financed through the European Investment Bank, not by the Juncker Plan, not by the instruments that we heard the EIB is developing so far, but through a very large scale, 5% of Euro area GDP, Green New Deal for Europe, with the European Central Bank agreeing to or participating in this partnership with the EIB, turning most of the QE firepower towards purchasing in the secondary markets the EIB bonds that would finance this. At the same time, we could split our Eurozone member state debt into two parts, the Maastricht compliant part and the rest, and create an interest rate differential between the two in order to create incentive compatible rules within the European Union, within our Eurozone. That kind of redeployment of existing institutions, simulating federation, would lead to the stabilization of the Eurozone so that we can then have the conversation we haven't had yet on how to begin a constitutional assembly process by which to create the European Union Constitution that will replace the existing treaties and take us towards the road to a federation that could actually work stably and sustainably in the future. But the large question, and I have 40 seconds to finish this, Martin, is this. Can a European Union founded as a cartel of heavy industry and based on a bureaucracy which consistently depoliticizes political decisions be democratized in this way, and can it come to terms with the denial that it has been experiencing and displaying over the last 5-6 years regarding the impossibility of enforcing rules that were not fit to purpose? This is the great question, and the future of Europe will depend on answering it in the affirmative. Thank you.